Memory. What does it mean to remember something? I have a picture here, a wedding picture. This happens to be my wedding picture from a number of years ago. And the question is, when I say I remember this, I can sit there and I can say, I remember where it was. I remember a lot of the things we said. I remember the main events. I remember going to the church. I remember going to the reception and where the reception was and what kind of cake we had and things like that. That's memory. It's kind of, what does it mean to remember? I also can be typing on the computer. And I remember that. That's a muscle memory. Typing. I can do it without really thinking about it. I have pictures of my kids over here. I can remember when this picture was taken. Okay? Remember that we were at the zoo and what we were doing. There's different types of memory. There's the process. That's what psychologists look at when they look at memory. They look at, what does memory mean? How do memories affect our behavior? First of all, memory has three different pieces: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is basically the taking in of information. Now, how do we take in information? We can take in information from hearing it. You all can listen to things and take in those words and take it in that way. We can take it in through doing stuff. We can take it in through, I have this piece of paper. We can take it in through reading it, through visual, either visually written words or visual pictures. We have semantic, acoustic, okay? Visual. Semantic is taking it in terms of meaning. So we can encode things in terms of meaning, in terms of it. The gist is something like this. Okay. What is classical conditioning? We can remember that by the general idea of what it is. We can remember classical conditioning acoustically. Remember the name, classical conditioning. We can remember it in different ways. We can remember it visually, where it has CC. So there's different things of encoding, taking things in. Then there's storage. How do we keep memories? Think of a file cabinet. How do we keep memories? Well, there's three things. There's sensory memory, which is the immediate intake. And that is kind of encoding, but it's also part of storage. It's the immediate intake. I'm looking around this room and I see the pictures and I see the walls and I'm taking in everything. That is sensory memory. Sensory memory has two main pieces, echoic and iconic. Iconic is the visual processing of everything that is in your visual field. That's iconic. Echoic, think of an echo, is auditory processing. Have you ever had this sensation where somebody's asked you something and you're like, what? And then you proceed to answer the question. That is because that question is still in your echoic memory. It's in that immediate intake. So that immediate intake, that sensory register, sensory memory, good things and bad things. The good thing is it can have an unlimited amount of information. You're processing everything that's in your world. The bad thing is it goes boom and it's out of there. Visual, like third of a second, like boom. Visual is really quick. If you don't pay attention to it, it's gone. Auditory, maybe a couple seconds, if that. Same thing. If you don't pay attention to it, it's gone. So that question somebody asked you, if you did not think about it, that question would have been gone in a couple seconds. So that's the thing with sensory memory. It's a lot of stuff, but it's gone immediately. Well, the next piece is what's called short-term or working memory. Sometimes people delineate between the two. Sometimes people lump those two together. But it's the stuff you're working on right now, the stuff you're thinking about right now. Right now, I am thinking about talking about memory. I am thinking about, okay, what are the different things that I would like my students to come out of this with? I'm thinking about, what do I need to make sure and say? I'm thinking about, should I have written all this down, and so on and so forth. That's what's going through your mind right now. What's going through my mind is also the things I have to do today. So it can be obviously what's going through your mind, what you're doing right now, or it can be other things. You can be sitting in a class and thinking about a fight you had with your roommate. So it's your working memory or your short-term memory is what your brain is currently processing. Okay? And short-term memory, and see, I'm using my memory aid here, which we're going to get to, in terms of what I need to make sure and remember to talk about. And we're going to talk about memory aids. Short-term memory, there's this thing called the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. There was this guy that had this study that looked at how many things can we process at the same time. And in normal adults, he came up with this magic number 7 plus or minus 2. Now, it has since been modified a little bit, but in general, we can hold on to approximately 7 pieces of information. If those pieces of information are very difficult, then it's more like 5. If those pieces of information are really easy, it's more like 9. That's the plus or minus 2. And that's how much. So that's working memory or short-term memory. It's you take in all the stuff, you pay attention. It's what you're paying attention to right now. Short-term memory has a limited capacity, and you can remember it as long as you're currently thinking about it. But once you stop thinking about it, it fades. Somebody tells you a phone number. What do? You repeat it over and over so it doesn't fade. That's the thing about sensory memory. It lasts about short-term memory. Short-term memory lasts longer than sensory, but it has limited capacity. So then we get into long-term memory, because there's things, like I said, my wedding stuff. I mean, obviously this happened a while ago, okay? The events with my kids happened a while ago. And I remember them. I remember my wedding. I remember what was going on. How does that work? Because I'm not currently thinking about it. I mean, I can be, but I'm not constantly thinking about it. It's not happening right now. That's long-term memory. Long-term memory is stuff that stays. It has unlimited capacity. In other words, unlimited amount of stuff that we can remember, and an unlimited time frame. We could theoretically remember it forever. Okay, so I want to talk about what types of long-term memory there are and some possible issues with long-term memory in terms of how can we better get things into our long-term memory, what causes us to forget, can we have false long-term memories? Okay, first of all, what are the types of long-term memory? Well, you can separate it into 2 major pieces, explicit and implicit. Explicit is, and again, I'm using my memory aid here, okay? This is the notes in terms of the outline of what I wanted to make sure and tell everybody. So there's explicit versus implicit. Explicit is stuff that you know you remember. I ask you, who was your freshman English teacher in high school? And a lot of people can pull that out of their head, pull that out of their memory. That's explicit. You purposely remember it, you know you remember it. Then there's implicit. I'm sitting there typing on a computer. I'm not thinking about it. I'm not purposely saying, Fingers remember how to type. People that play musical instruments sometimes have that implicit memories. Emotional memories are often implicit memories. Okay? If you're someplace and you're suddenly feeling an emotion because it's tied to something, that's an implicit memory. You're not purposely trying to remember something. So explicit can be episodic or semantic. Episodic are events. My wedding is a really good example of an episodic memory. Your first day of college, episodic memory. Your senior prom, if you went to it, that's an episodic memory. Okay? Think episodic as episodes, events. Thinking about events. And typically it's autobiographical. It's events that happen to you. It doesn't have to be, but it's typically thinking about life events that happen to us. Semantic is facts and figures. Think of it as facts and figures. If I were to say, who was the vice president under Bill Clinton? You would pull out of your memory Al Gore. That would be a semantic memory. It's a meaning. It's a fact, figure. It's a, when I say fact and figure, it doesn't have to be numbers. It's something that you pull out. It's meaning. It's a, if I were to say the Pythagorean theorem, if I were to say, who's the guy who did the experiment with dogs for classical conditioning? Pavlov. That's a semantic memory. Semantic memory are, again, facts and figures. So we have episodic and semantic. Implicit memories can be procedural. Classic procedural memories are things like muscle memories, things like typing, things like riding a bike, things like driving a car sometimes, if you're not thinking about it. Things that you're doing without purposely thinking about it. Okay? It's kind of that muscle memory. That's what procedural memories are. The other thing is emotional memories. You go into a place and you're feeling this emotion because it's tied to something else. Emotional memories. So those are the different kinds. Okay, so we talked about encoding, taking stuff in. We talked about storage with sensory, short-term and long-term. Retrieval. How do you get memories out? Well, the two different types of retrieval tasks are recall and recognition. Recall is like when I asked who was the vice president under Bill Clinton. I'm not giving you any hints or anything. I'm just saying who was it. That would be recall. You have to come up with Al Gore. Recognition would be, a classic example of recognition would be a multiple choice test, where you're getting options and you just have to recognize the correct option. It's where you're given a cue. So recall, you just have to pull it out of your head. Recognition, you're given a cue. That's the difference. Okay, so that's encoding, storage, retrieval. Now, let's dig into this more. What parts of the brain deal with memory? Well, a big part is the hippocampus. Hippocampus deals with, it's primarily turning those short-term memories into long-term, and deals with a lot of the explicit stuff, the semantic and episodic. Okay? That's hippocampus. Now, you also have the amygdala and the cerebellum. The amygdala deals with a lot of emotional memories. So remember, amygdala, emotions. And the cerebellum deals with a lot of those procedural or muscle memories. So those are the parts of the brain that deal with memory. Okay. Now, what about potential issues when it comes to memory? Okay. For instance, I'm sitting here talking about memory, and I have to think, oh, what do I need to make sure and talk about next? So what do? I pick up a piece of paper, and I say, oh, retrieval, parts of the brain, flashbulb memories. I didn't talk about flashbulb memories. What are flashbulb memories? And then we have potential memory problems. Okay, flashbulb memories, going back to kind of types of memories. Flashbulb memories are a specific type of memory. It's when something unusual happens. Classic example is if you look at a lot of psych books, they say, ask your students what they were doing on September 11th, 2001. Well, there's a problem with that. A lot of incoming college students were not old enough to remember what was happening on September 11th, 2001. My incoming freshmen this past year would have been 1 to 2, if that. Because they were, and you are going to have some incoming freshmen this year that were born in 2001. So they're not going to be able to remember because they were just not old enough. So that's not going to work. But if you ask your parents, if you are that age, if you are 19, 20 years old, or basically typical college age, 18 to 22, if you ask your parents what they were doing on September 11th, 2001, they would be able to tell you exactly what they were doing. I can tell you exactly what I was doing on September 11th, 2001. If you ask your grandparents what they were doing when they found out JFK was shot, they would be able to tell you. Okay? That's a flashbulb memory. It's when something, usually a big event, something happens, you have these, it almost seems like it's burned into your memory. It's that flashbulb, boom, like a picture. Now, the thing about flashbulb memories, they seem very vivid and they seem very clear. They aren't any more accurate than any other memories. They just seem that way. I could easily, and we're going to learn about false memories, I could tell you the whole story about what I was doing on September 11th. But does that mean every detail I remember is correct? No. It's no more correct than any other memory I have. Now, you all can try it. I can ask you, what were you doing election night 2016? A lot of people nowadays, that was a big event in their mind because regardless of what side of the political spectrum you're on, it was unexpected. It was something that was not predicted. It was unusual. Okay? And that's what makes it a flashbulb memory. It's something, now, was that as big of an event as September 11th? To most people, no. But regardless, flashbulb memory. So that's a flashbulb memory. What are some potential problems with memories? Well, we have amnesia. Amnesia is basically an organic kind of forgetting. In other words, your brain just physically cannot remember. There is anterograde and retrograde amnesia. You can remember, you can forget things from after a traumatic experience or things from before, okay? And usually when you think about amnesia, you think of some kind of head trauma. And forgetting because somebody was in a car accident and they have amnesia. That's one possible reason for forgetting, okay? Now, what are some other things? And you can see I'm doing this a little bit on purpose because I'm showing what are some memory aids, okay? So we have amnesia, we have false memories. Can our memories be incorrect? Yes, they can. In short, yes, they can. They absolutely can be incorrect. How can they be incorrect? Well, they can be incorrect because of misattribution or source error. In other words, we're remembering something as a true memory when it may have been a dream. It may have been something somebody told us that was that other person's memory. Those are two common reasons why someone might have a false memory. Or it could have been somebody introduced something different or false. There's a lady named Elizabeth Loftus that's done a lot of studies on eyewitness testimony and how eyewitness testimony can have issues. She did a big study, and that's when you do your research project. One of the possibilities is to look at some of Loftus's work. She did a big study showing people videos of car accidents and then asking specific questions, like how fast was the car going when they bumped into the other car? How fast was the car going when it hit the other car? How fast was the car going when it smashed into the other car? And even just the one word affected what the person remembered a week later. She also introduced somebody talking about a stop sign, I believe. There were some things that she introduced that weren't really in the video. And she said, she talked about a stop sign, and then the next week, people actually thought they remembered it. They did a study introducing a memory to people that they were lost in a mall when they were little. And they thought they really remembered being lost in a mall. So people's memories are funny things in terms of they can be messed with. That's why when we talked about in the consciousness chapter, when we talked about hypnosis, you need to really be careful, because anything, especially in a state where you're suggestible, anything can mess with those memories. And it can be easy to get false memories. And now, this brings up the idea of eyewitness testimony. It also brings up the idea of repressed memories. Can people purposely repress memories? Yes. Yes. It's entirely possible. The stories that you hear of people who, as an adult, remember horrific childhood abuse. It's possible. What I would say, and I think what a lot of experts would say at this point, is be skeptical and verify. So if somebody says they're remembering this childhood abuse, look for evidence. It's possible, but it's also possible that it's a false memory. So look for evidence, verify, see if there's anything to back it up. That's what I think a lot of people would say about repressed memories nowadays, because a lot of the work has shown that some of those memories can be inaccurate and false, but it is possible to have true ones. So you don't want to discount it, but you don't want to automatically assume that it's correct either. So now we have forgetting. So if I remember the question I asked you, who was Bill Clinton's vice president? If you did not remember Al Gore, why would you not have remembered Al Gore? Or the wedding picture. If I asked my husband what flavor was we had cheesecake for our wedding. If I asked my husband what flavor was the cheesecake we had at our wedding, and he's like, I don't know. Now, actually, I think he would remember that. But if he said, why do we forget things? Why do we say, I don't know? Well, there's a number of reasons. And I'm going to go down through the list, because lists are a good way to help your memory. Encoding failure. We didn't take it in to begin with. If I asked, who was the vice president under Jimmy Carter? I don't remember who the vice president, actually, I'm trying to remember, was it Dole? I'm not sure. I'm not sure who the vice president under Jimmy Carter is. I'm going to have to look it up afterwards, because now I'm going to be curious. Why? Because maybe I never encoded it to begin with. I was too young at the time, possibly. Okay. Regardless, maybe I never encoded it to begin with. Another is decay. Maybe I did learn it, but I haven't thought about who the vice president was under Jimmy Carter for eons. And you can lose, memories can fade over time. So there's encoding failure, there's decay, there is lack of attention or absent-mindedness. You can get distracted. You can not pay attention, which can lead to encoding failure. So encoding failure, decay, lack of attention, blocking. You don't want to remember. Kind of purposeful not remembering, purposeful forgetting. I'll think about that tomorrow. That's when you have that one piece of purposeful forgetting are repressed memories. It's when you don't want to remember, so you physically don't. Then we have interference. You remember the name of the vice president under Jimmy Carter, but then you have the other vice presidents that came after that, and you get them confused. Or I learned French when I was in high school and college. Well, subsequently, I've been learning Spanish. So interference. Some of those new Spanish words can interfere with my knowledge that I had of French, or vice versa. Some of my French words can interfere when I try to think of a word in Spanish, and I come up with a French word. Okay? Retroactive and proactive interference. Stuff that you learn after can interfere with stuff that's previously learned, or vice versa. Stuff that you've learned previously can interfere with stuff that you're learning right now. Okay, enhancing memory. One way to enhance memory, making lists. Basically, you're forcing yourself. You're not going to physically remember it, but it's going to help with the problem of forgetting. You're going to have that. You have rehearsal. Basically, you can have regular rote rehearsal, which is just repeating stuff over and over and over and over and over. And then you can have elaborative rehearsal. When I try to remember names from classes, I try to connect students. When I look at their pictures, I try to connect with something that they have. It can help. It can also lead to problems because I connect, somebody's wearing some really funky glasses in a picture, and I remember them because of their funky glasses. Or somebody has a very distinct hair color. And then guess what? I get to class. They're not wearing their glasses. Or they colored their hair. Or somebody had really long, there was a young lady who had really long curly hair and they cut it. So sometimes those things can work depending on what you tie it to. So there's rehearsal, which is just saying stuff over and over and over. There's elaborative rehearsal, which is tying stuff to stuff you already know. And then there's mnemonics. If I were to ask people the colors of the rainbow, okay, I'm going to ask you, what are the colors of the rainbow? How many of you thought of Roy G. Biv? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Okay, that's an example of a mnemonic. It is a memory trick. Roy G. Biv, even the alphabet song is a memory trick for kids. The planets. My very excellent mother. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. Of course, it had to be changed when Pluto became no longer a planet. But those are examples of mnemonics. They can be little songs. They can be acronyms. It's a variety of different things. It's basically little memory tricks. So, memory. What is it? It's encoding, storage, and retrieval. Different kinds of encoding, different kinds of storage. We have sensory, short-term, long-term, retrieval. We have recognition and recall. Problems with memory, potential problems. We have amnesia, we have decay, we have interference, we can have false memories. We have a lot of different things going on with memory. What are some different ways to help with memory? Mnemonics, okay, rehearsal. There's also one thing before I get off of this, there's also a thing called chunking. in class, I like to write out a list of letters and say, can you remember these letters? Well, the letters are F, B, I, C, I, A, I, R, S, N, S, A. If you remember them as individual letters, it's difficult. But if you remember them as the acronyms, FBI, CIA, NSA, you get the point. It's you're chunking, you're putting it together. That's what a lot of people do with Social Security numbers. You have the first three, the second two, and the last four, you chunk them. That's chunking. Phone numbers, 3 digits, 4 digits. Okay, that's chunking. What you're doing is that short-term memory where you can have 7 things, you're taking 12 things and making 4. When you say 7 things, it can be an individual number, or it can be a chunk. When you're chunking, you're making less numbers of things. So, going to my memory aid here, we have other stuff. Now, this chapter had left out a few different things, and a few different things that I wanted to make sure and go over. One thing was the serial position effect. If I were to give you a list of things to remember, and then give you about 30 seconds to a minute, and then say remember it, you would remember the first things on the list and the last things on the list better than the stuff in the middle of the list. Why? Well, the last stuff on the list can still be in your short-term memory. The first stuff on the list, you've had more time to rehearse it. The middle stuff is what gets left out. That is the serial position effect. You remember the first and the last pieces better. We also have tip of the tongue phenomena. Tip of the tongue is where you've remembered something. Typically, it's remembering something acoustically, remembering something in terms of how it sounds. And you're like, I know it sounds like, or it starts with, and you can get it if you're given a cue. It's like it's almost there, tip of the tongue. And it's because of the way you've encoded it. Okay? Now we also have context and state dependent memory. This is an interesting one, and this is in a lot of intro textbooks. Context and state dependent memory. Context is kind of where you are. If you take a class in a classroom and you learn a lot of the material in that classroom, you will remember it better in that classroom. If you study in your bedroom, you will remember the material better in your bedroom. Context, think of the location, the atmosphere. State-dependent memory is a specific type of context. You will remember stuff in the same physical or emotional state in which you learned it. So, if you are on your 3rd cup of coffee and you're hyped up and you're thoroughly caffeinated when you're learning something, you're going to remember it better when you're thoroughly caffeinated. A lot of people ask, does that mean if something happens while you're drunk, you're going to remember it better while you're drunk? To some extent, yes. If you're not so drunk that you're forgetting everything, yes. The same emotional, if you are in a joyful, happy state, you may remember more things about the joyful, fuzzy, wuzzy things about your relationship that you're in now. Okay? If you are angry, you're more likely to remember things that happened while you were angry in the past. It's easier to remember things if you are in the same emotional or physical state as when you learn them. So, the last thing is infantile amnesia. And I kind of want to end with this because this is an interesting one. If I were to ask you, what's the earliest thing you can remember? Try that. What's the earliest thing you can remember? How old were you during that memory? For most people, It's about age 3 to 4. Why? That's called infantile amnesia. We don't typically remember things from earlier than around age 3 or 4, typically. And if we think we do, a lot of that is because people have told us about the events. There's a lot of theories as to why that happens. The theory that I think makes most sense is the way that it's processed. A lot of people under the age of 3 are not that verbal. So when they take in stuff, they're not taking it in verbally. They're not taking it in with words. As adults, that's how we remember a lot of things. We remember the words, the meaning. We remember the meaning of the event. We remember what happened in terms of describing it with words. But we don't have the words before about age 3. That's when kids, we're going to learn that in developmental. That's when kids really end up being pretty verbal. So that's the biggest theory, is that it's just encoded differently. Because it's encoded differently, it's hard to retrieve. So that's memory, and I hope you all remember a lot of the stuff we went over.